This video is going to cover the topic solidification and the argument formation for our social movement project. Before we begin, let's go over our objectives. Number 1, we are going to discuss the shape of an argument. Number 2, we'll look at a school uniform example to add some context to that shape. Number 3, we're going to discuss our counter arguments and our corresponding rebuttals. And then number 4 will be your turn. So let's start out with the shape. I like to think of an argument as a triangle with 3 distinct parts. First, we have our claim or our thesis statement. This is that arguable position that you can back up with reasons to substantiate your claim and bring your thesis to life. It's not enough to just have reasons to back up your position in an argument. In order to make sure that you're actually making sense, you'll want to provide some evidence to support that argument in the first place. And if you remember back to our discussions during class, that evidence is all going to be located through those sources that you've verified as credible and true. Let's add some context and look at an example argument about school uniforms. Here's our triangle. Let's fill it up with a claim. In this scenario, let's say that school uniforms should be made mandatory at Jacobs in order to increase school connectedness. Notice how that's an arguable position because someone can obviously disagree and have the opposite opinion of that. And additionally, the claim or that thesis statement is the smallest part of the overall argument triangle. It takes up the least amount of space. It's just a single sentence. And even though we can consider that claim to be the most important piece of the entire argument, it's still supported by our line of reasoning, which in this case splinters off into 3 separate parts. Number 1, we can back up our claim by saying that students are too distracted by fashion, which gets in the way of classwork. Additionally, we could say that different clothing styles lead to social division and end up splitting the student body into cliques. Last, let's say that school uniforms could be partially paid for by the district, which would end up saving families a ton of money every single year. Now, this is just a hypothetical situation, but I hope we see that we take our one arguable claim about this one particular topic, which would be pro-school uniforms, and then we back it up right underneath that triangle with 3 reasons that help beef it up. It supports my position. I'm not just saying that I believe in school uniforms. I'm telling you exactly why. A proper argument is incomplete if it doesn't have the base of the triangle. If you ignore actual evidence to support why you believe in the reasons that support your claim in the first place. So in this example, let's say that I've got 5 pieces of evidence. The first is a primary source, which is a uniform guide from top-ranking schools in Illinois, showing us that you could achieve these high test scores and the high student buy-in while also having a school uniform mandate. Second could be a secondary source from edweek.org, which would be an analysis of how school uniforms lead to higher test scores. We'll throw in another secondary source from Forbes.com, which would be an editorial about how teen fashion trends distract from time spent studying. Let's throw in a tertiary source, which would be references to a nationwide database that logs school dress codes with relation to test scores. And then for good measure, we'll throw in source number 5 as another primary, which would be district expense reports indicating that uniform costs are covered by school funds. Notice how all of the corresponding pieces of evidence from valid and vetted sources directly support each reason that I've provided, which in turn supports my claim or the thesis at the top. That's why the evidence that supports your argument is, without a doubt, one of the most important elements of a proper argument, because if your evidence is not intact, your reasoning cannot be formed, and therefore your claim or your thesis statement is in jeopardy. Let's discuss the last piece of an effective argument, which would be the counter argument and the corresponding rebuttal. The counter argument represents a line of reasoning to go against your claim or thesis statement. It seeks to undermine the argument that you've been building throughout this entire process, from your reasoning to that evidence that you've provided as well. For this example, let's say that someone says school uniforms actually strip students of individuality, which ends up weakening academic and social engagement. And let's say, hypothetically, you've provided some sourced information to back up this counterargument. Your argument grows weak and flawed if you ignore this counterargument and let it persist alongside the claim and thesis that you are trying to actually argue for. So we need to provide a rebuttal, which could take the form of a primary source of a local school that has students decorate the entire building through their own artwork, which actually ends up giving them a sense of ownership over the building and therefore a stronger sense of community overall, despite whether or not they actually have to wear uniforms. Does that rebuttal completely refortify the original argument that you had made? Not necessarily, but at the same time, it doesn't really have to. It's pretty difficult to come up with a perfect argument. So you'll just want to be sure that with the arguments that you have created, you've got a direct reference to a valid counterargument and then are able to form a logical rebuttal to put that to bed before it does actually end up making your argument invalid. Now, it's your turn. Let's design an argument and then solidify your topic so that you'll be ready to submit that social movement project in the form of that written editorial in a few weeks. Please reach out to me with questions.